So first and foremost, like, thanks everyone for joining. I think we've been very surprised by just like how well attended and how much interest there is in these. I think we started doing them kind of to substitute our usual in-person meetups that we used to do, and I think the response has been so great that, like, whatever happens after COVID, like, there's definitely going to be some type of continuation of kind of like this live type of format. Um, but yeah, so today we're going to have Ben. He's going to talk a bit about React, a bit about his experience with React. I myself do a lot of React work, so I'm super excited to hear about that. As mentioned previously, like, any questions, like, as he talks, like, just leave questions in the text chat. Sometimes even attendees themselves might even be able to answer your question, and if not, then, like, we can probably have a bit of a break in between the talk, and kind of Ben can take some time to answer some of the questions and so forth. But yeah, on that note, I'm happy to hand over to Ben.
Cool. Will you give me the power to share my screen?
Do you not have that power?
I do not have that power. You have to enable it.
You have been granted that power.
I have the power.
Use it
Let's
wisely.
share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, it's looking good on my side.
Okay, cool. So, can I minimize this? Move this out of the way. There we go. Cool. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. It really means a lot to me to have a bunch of people stare at what I'm about to share. So this talk is called 5 Years of React. It's technically 6 years now since I wrote and first gave this talk in 2019. But it's about patterns, practices, and pitfalls. So that was the original title. So the motivation for this talk originally was that I was going to do like a whole history of React and how we used to do things and how we do it now, like starting with create class and mixins and then moving over to class-based and the Redux era and the MobX era and into hooks and all of that now. And I just realized that that would mean there'd be like 40 minutes of talk that would be completely irrelevant to everyone here, and like 20 minutes of value. So what I decided to do is instead frame this talk differently, in a way where it highlights some of my bugbears. I've been on many React projects since I'm a consultant, so I've seen various things reoccurring between all my clients, that are just my bugbears that I would like to address and I would like to show people some solutions to, um, and then just some good practices and patterns that I've picked up over time. So why is this talk in TypeScript? Because I fundamentally believe that TypeScript makes my code more maintainable. And a lot of this talk is also about creating reusable and shareable components and things. And TypeScript enables you to do that in a much cleaner way with a much better developer experience than just pure JavaScript does. That's not saying that I dislike pure JavaScript. It's just saying that I prefer building my production things in TypeScript. And this talk is also in TypeScript. So let's kind of just jump into it. We're going to start with the construction of a truly reusable component, trademarked. So as we go through this, the first few things are going to seem really super simple and like obvious, but I found time and time again that some people are missing just some of the very to me fundamental things, to other people fundamental things, but at some point all of us had to learn them. So some of those things are in this talk. And we're going to start with prefer the use of the children prop over the use of text label content props. So this better enables composition. So what does this mean? Here's an example of a bad component. a button that takes a prop called text, that takes a string hello and then renders that button out. What do you want? You want to leverage the children prop because it enables composition. So here's a good example of enabling composition. I can throw an icon along with some text into a button. Now, for the uninitiated, um, every single React component, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. Every single React component has a property called children. It's the only implicit property on a component. And what that is it's the stuff you pass in between when you open up your component like this. It's the stuff inside here. This highlighted bit, that's children. Um, so now that you know that there's a children prop, you can use the children prop to just enable and promote composition of components. Back to slides. Okay, so that was more basic stuff. Let's move on. Unless you are trying to encapsulate the API of a component, you should be exposing the API of that component or the decorated component. So what do I mean by that? So let's take a look here and you'll see this is a little bit more code now. But what I've got here at the very top is a type for my button props. And I'm saying, okay, right now I don't have anything special here. I don't have any special props, but I want you to take all the default button HTML attributes for the button HTML element and put that into this type. So we're joining those two types together. So this is going to add all those default things like on click, style, class name, the default implementation for children, on blur, on focus, all those things that you don't want to have to manually type over and over and over again, you can extract like this. So if you were doing a div, you would just do HTML attributes, HTML div element to get the types, right? So this just gets the types and your autocomplete out. Then you're going to jump into your component, and what we're going to do is we're going to use children for composition, like I said. But then we're going to pull out the remainder of the props. So all those extra things I talked about now, on click, on focus, on blur, are in this props here. And we're going to just spread that onto the button. And important when you're spreading is that you want to keep the spread as far left as you possibly can to avoid it overriding things that you want to explicitly specify. So we're spreading all those remainder props on click, on focus, all those things. And then we're taking the class name. And this is one of my very, very big bugbears is when developers forget to pass class name down into components. Because if you don't have class name, it breaks libraries like styled components. It breaks most CSS and JS things. It breaks React transition group. It breaks Expo. So you should always, always, always pass your class name down to a component to enable those libraries to do their work and also to make the developer extending your component's life a little bit easier. And one nifty library for that is class names that just helps you extend your class names cleanly. So what do we have here now? Here's an example usage. I can set the button type because the HTML attributes has exposed that for me. This prop spread is going to put it on the component for me. I can use the style object. I can pass a special class name, and I'm using children for composition. Now this one is one of my favorite things in the world is the proxy component pattern. So I want you to learn what this is and then just consider using it where you think it's going to be nifty. So if you've ever used something like semantic UI or material UI or Chakra or any of the big component libraries, you'll notice most of them have this as attribute on their components. So that's this example isn't great. Button as a div is not really what you want most of the time. But if you've ever had, like, let's say a material UI tab component, and you wanted to turn the tabs into links instead of having them be on clicks with history.push or whatever, you can use the proxy component pattern. You can go as another component as a React Router link to destination. So this will take my button element, turn it into a React Router link, apply all its styles and all its properties to it, and then also pull in the properties of that thing. So how do we do this? Because this looks hella complicated, but it really isn't. Um, we're going to come in and we're going to look at our type first. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to extend our base types like we always should. We're going to put an as, this proxy component prop as, and we're just going to turn it into any. There is a way you can type this to be the React component constructor, but that's prone to certain kinds of failures when you specify components differently. So I always just leave it as any because I'm lazy like that. And then what we're doing is we're doing another intersect saying that, okay, these are my known attributes, but because I can be acting as another component, I want to be able to have any other prop. So that's what this is doing here. And then we're going to jump into our button, and there's a lot of extra code here, but I want you to see how simple this is. So I've got this as prop. I'm going to go as or button is comp, and then I can just use comp like that. It's really as simple as that. So if as is specified, use whatever as is, otherwise use button, and then render that component and pass through all the props. And because we're passing the remainder of the props, any props that that thing is expecting in here will be passed through to it as well. Now, the other important thing I want you to notice here is what I'm using is forward ref. So when you're building a component library, not when you're building like general components for your day-to-day work, but if you're building a design system or a component library, it's incredibly important that you start using React forward ref. So what forward ref does is it gives you two arguments here. So your first argument as always is props, and the second argument is the ref pointer. And then you can pass that ref pointer to wherever in your component tree for this component you want it to go. So if you don't do this, you don't get a ref into this component. You can't shell out of React and do things to it. So it's of utmost importance that when you are working with a design system or a component library, you do forward ref to enable the users of your library to be able to shell out of React when they need to, or to be able to do just like performance-based static event handling or whatever they need to do. And then finally, I want you to expose the CSS API of nested children. So Material UI does this really well. I think Chakra does this really well as well. But basically what I mean by this is, let's jump into our editor here. So let's say I have this component here and I have a div and a div, and we jump in a bit deeper and we go another div. Live coding is the best, isn't it? We have another div and we do what I said we should do, and we extract class name here. Right, we pass that down, but now I come along, I'm another developer, I go I want to edit this component, and I know that component is going to get my class name, and it's going to be custom, and I go and write my CSS and I go custom has a background color of red. And then I jump into the browser and I see that, oh crap, that background color is actually not on the div I wanted. So then I have to go, okay, well, inside custom, there's the first div. Do I do it like that, or do I do div first child? I have to style the first child, and this is really just horribly, horribly hacky because you can't always get at the element you want to. But if you go and you say, you know what, I have an object called classes here, and we'll say classes is just index of string, then I can go class name here is classes.innerdiv. And that means that now I can go to this component and I go classes innerdiv gets my custom background. Right, so you can see how when you can't jump into this component, when it's not something that you have direct access to and you can go in and you can just add this custom class name, when you have a reusable component that you're using across teams, for example, enabling your fellow developers to be able to seamlessly jump into the CSS API of that component is going to make their life to keep in mind in future. Back to presentation. Boolean props are generally bad. I want you to consider using what I call variant props. So what is a Boolean prop and why is it bad? So if we look at this example here, this button, it's both large and small. It's inverted, outlined, and primary. How do you think this button is going to render? Is it going to be big? Is it going to be small? Is it going to be outlined or inverted? I don't know. This is why Boolean props generally are a bad idea. There are good use cases for a Boolean prop, like for example, on a button disabled is fine. But what I want you to prefer is using what I call variant props, where you have, for example, size is of an enum, variant is of an enum, because they're just a little bit more descriptive about what's going on. I think ultimately what I'm trying to say is when you're using a Boolean prop, think really hard and long about why you want to be using that Boolean prop, and is there an alternative, for example, an enum that could work better. A brief aside, let's take some questions quickly. If there are questions, Skull, can you read out some questions to me if there are any?
It's just a classic Michael message about his his brain cell being blown. But no, there are no questions. But like I have loads on my side, so if you don't mind, like let me maybe throw a couple of my own. Also, you know, like let me maybe just ask: is there anyone who wants to kind of like ask a audio question?
From my side, you guys can hear me, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I said my brain cell was blown because I spent like one day. So I implemented React Router and I've just come back to React. Let me frame things. Everyone knows me as the Vue guy. Blah blah blah. You know, love throwing Vue in there whenever I can. But started a new company, jumped back into React, and just some of these got you kind of learn along the way. So implemented React Router, and I was wondering why my state was disappearing whenever I navigated, you know, between two pages. The long and short of it was that I identified that the previous guy that built the thing had hrefs like directly navigating you, and we had then React Router working on some of the pages. So when you navigated from a link to then href and coming back, it would just lose state completely. So I spent the whole day busy like finding all these places where it was like hrefs and changing it to links and blah blah blah. And then you showed me that the prototype pattern where you can just have anything, be replaced or be represented by a link component, and it could have saved me so much time. And you could kind of keep the integrity of the styling and how things behave. Then it would just kind of be enabled and keep the state of navigation and stuff. So it's just comments on why that blew my brain cell.
I find that also very helpful, like especially when you, for example, you mentioned material UI, like when you are working with something that's kind of a visual representation of a button, but semantically it should be a link. I find it also helpful in that case to kind of just say, okay, this should actually semantically be a link, although it looks like a button. I actually learned this I think I actually learned it from you, actually. I think you told me about it once, and I've been using it all over. So I think from my side, I have a specific question, and that is regarding encapsulation. So I tend to actually be very conservative in the props that I expose, because like maybe I've just been burnt, like had bad experiences in the past where people don't read the documentation properly, or they don't look at the API, and they like actually end up replicating things that are already covered in the use cases of the component by using like external classes and things like that. So I think like obviously these things make sense for me for like material UI and so forth, because those things are built to kind of just be a basis and for you to apply your own styling on top of them. Are there like is this a problem that you've run into, like is this a problem that you actually ever really face, or am I being a bit too dogmatic here in terms of controlling the API and narrowing the API as much as possible to kind of just prevent people from going crazy and doing weird stuff?
I mean, like, I'm not gonna go as far as to say you should expose every use callback into a prop that could trigger it. There definitely is data privacy concerns for a component. But when it comes to just the default browser stuff, things like on focus, on click, on hover, class name, I think those are at a bare minimum essential to be exposed to make things usable.
But I guess it also depends on the nature of the project. Like if it's a closed team and like you can all talk to one another, and it's like, okay, cool. Like if you want to use this component in a way that's currently not covered, like let's look at the component, let's see how we can extend that instead of just giving you the tools to kind of break the kind of encapsulation of the components. I guess it's also certain projects and certain structures. No, so I was just curious about that, because like, yeah, I guess both sides have kind of because I think like you mentioned, like, you might then actually start doing like first div or first child in your CSS selectors and those things. And that's not like now people are not even like kind of breaking your encapsulation in proper ways. Now they're like using hacky techniques to do it. So I guess that can also have unintended consequences. Okay, cool. No, I was just curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think fundamentally developers will always find a way. I just like finding that way easy for them.
Yeah, but not too easy.
Sorry,
Cool.
while you're on that slide, I had
Yeah.
probably a very basic question, but I haven't used or seen the syntax of that class names combiner. Whenever I do that, I just do that using backtick string, and I do UI button and then class name. What's the advantage of that?
That's a library. So class names is a really nifty library, and I'm just going to do a super quick example of it. So what you can do is you can import class names from the class names package, class names, and then it has a bunch of really nifty features. So you can do just a bunch of strings it'll concatenate them with spaces. If you put undefined in there, unlike doing it with backticks, you're not going to get random undefines in your CSS. So it's just going to remove them. But now here is where class names get really, really nifty. So let's say we're doing a button component here, right? We're doing a button component here. And this button component takes a prop called size, and size can either be large, or small. What we can then do is we can go here and we can pull out size, and then we can come into class names and we can say class big should be applied when size is large. Class small should be applied when size is small. So this is where class names gets really useful when you've got these kind of logical class names that need to be applied under certain circumstances.
Okay, cool. Yeah, guess it's a bit neater than ternaries and stuff like that. So, oh, yeah. Cool, thanks.
Cool. Okay, back to talk. Thanks for the brief aside.
I just wanted to say that class names thing is really neat. I didn't even know about that.
Yeah, I haven't seen it before, so.
Yeah, I used to just roll my own helper function.
Yeah, class names has been around now since like the create element times. Maybe it's just proof that I'm a dinosaur. Maybe it's
no, I think
not
it also
as popular as it used to be.
I think it also maybe also as proof of how much I use styled components nowadays that I've never really needed to explore that more.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So a brief aside, there are 3 loading states. Always, at least 3 loading states. I've seen some people do 4. Loading, loaded, and error. So what am I talking about here? So when we're doing something asynchronous, right? We're going off and we're fetching something from an API. There are 3 stages to that. Loaded is the first state. It starts out at false. Loaded means, have I ever been called? Have I ever started running? Then second is loading, which is, am I busy being called? And then error is, have I failed being called? And this is generally only important when you're dealing with promises, because your promise won't throw into the component. You'll have to get it into the component somehow, and that's what you do with error. Loading, loaded, and error. So in this example, if we come in here to this people list, and people list is going to automatically fire off its hydrate function. We're going to start with not being loaded. That's going to throw up a full screen loading screen for us, and then kind of block user input. And then when it's done loading or it fails loading, it presents a failure screen with a try again. But when it's completely done loading, it presents the full screen with an overlay loader for loading. So I already have data. I'm loading again. I can render. Versus I have, for example, a shimmer effect or something for this loader. Now, what's also important about loaded is I often see people checking for if the data was returned back from the server, then there should be something there. But like sometimes it's a legitimate thing to get nothing back from the server. So let's say we have a list of people and the server returns 0 people. So empty array, and we were checking for, has this thing finished loading by checking the size of that array. We can't do that. That's why we have this loaded prop or this loading prop. Okay, cool. Thanks for that. Moving on. Actions on your context can and probably should return promises. This encourages composition. So let's say I have a context, a people context that has both create and hydrate, hydrate basically meaning load on it. If I make these things promises, I can go await create. That's the first thing that happens. It goes off, it runs, it does its thing, and then I can await hydrate. Um, that's kind of what I talk about when I talk about composition of actions out of contexts. Does that make sense? Does anyone have a question there? No questions? Okay, cool. Moving on. Service components are components that return null and are a good place to produce side effects. So a service component. This is a service component called hydrate person page. What it does is it takes all the contexts required for rendering a page for a person, and it makes sure that they're hydrated, and then it returns null. So if I go away feedback hub. If I go back here to my app example and I throw down my thing, let's say hydrate person, just like that, this is going to render nothing. It's not going to render anything, but if we go back to the presentation here and we look at it, it has a bunch of use effects. And it's responsible for its own full life cycle. So we've got use effect, hydrate person, takes in the ID. If the ID is changed, previous, if the ID has changed, reload, otherwise don't. And then we have hydrate locations, which always just loads once, and then hydrate positions, which always just loads once. That's a service component. So you can think of various nifty things to do with the service component, like keeping track in your store of pointer states, or listening to the user's microphone, or things like that. Service components are nifty like that. Now, we're kind of moving out of the React section of this talk. And we're moving into a more general SBA bugbear thing of mine. So this is learning to use roots. In the beginning, before React, Angular, Ember, Vue, even Backbone, there was the URL, the mighty URL. The URL was your best friend because there were really only 3 places to carry state in web applications: query parameters, form data, or the session. And the only way a user could get to a stateful page from you was to issue a GET request with some query parameters. Or, heck forbid, a form post. And this sucked because you can't bookmark a form post. SPAs have forgotten their roots, and that really sucks. It's really lame because there are some lessons we can learn from our forefathers. The mighty URL is just as powerful as it always was, and I think it's a little bit underused. So what do I mean by that? Let's consider a very simple CRUD scene. I've got here a thing that every single one of us has built 1,000 times, a grid with some stuff in it, some pagination, a search, some filters, a form that either creates or updates. Let's break this down. Let's figure out what our state is. First, we have whether we're editing or creating over here. So if we're editing, we can go /edit 1234, the ID. And I think most people are familiar with this. I've seen stuff like this in most React apps. And that's fine, that's great. Now we're using the URL to dictate our page state. We have one less thing to keep around in use state, and we have a bookmarkable, deep linkable page, which is nice. But before we can continue on to where else I'd like you to use the URL here, we need to talk about its parts of speech. So query parameters look like this, and everyone should be familiar with this. So you have your question mark after the URL, you have an attribute, you have its value, and you have another attribute and its other value. And that, when turned into an object, looks something like this: key, value, other key, other value. Okay, so that's straightforward and simple. Object parameters are a little bit more complicated. They get square braces. So you've got the object, its attribute, and the value for that attribute. The object, its attribute, and the value for that attribute. Turned into an object, it looks something like this: page, page, size, value, number, value. Array parameters are similar to that. You just say attribute empty square brace equals first index, second index, third index. Oh, I'm missing a 3 here. But that's what it looks like when it's turned into an object. Right, now we can jump back to our CRUD scene. So let's look at our states here. So in red here, we have search. Over in the URL, that search equals the value. In purple, we have status. Status can be an array of things. So we have active and disabled. Green, we have page. So page is an object with value of 2. We can have more things in that object. We can go, well, page has 10 items. Page is on third page, all that kind of stuff. And we can then further extend it with this form state as well. And all of this is now stuff that we don't have to have lying around in our use state. And it's stuff that when the user clicks refresh or Control R or F5, they keep around. And they can share this with people. They can go, oh, I want my coworker to see this drilled down version of this table, copy, paste, send it away. Now show me some code. How do I make this possible? It's surprisingly simple and easy. There is a library called useQueryParams that has hooks, high order components, and render props. The examples I'm going to show you here are hooks. And it's really as simple as going like, hey, I want a query parameter called X, it's a number. I want a query parameter called foo, it's a string. And then you can use that. And it's just like you state, you've got the value and a setter for that value. And then there's also a much more deeply nested version, useQueryParams, where you can have multiple params. So X, Q, filters with default values, all of that. So I beg you to go play around with this library. It's going to make your life so much more simpler, and it's going to save you a bunch of time and make your users very smiley and happy. Now on to the more, what's the word I'm looking for, controversial side of the talk. Flux is dead. Flux is dead because it's not. But what I mean by this is the majority of developers nowadays, when they're starting and they're coming into an application, aren't by default having the discussion of, oh, what is Flux? How do I use Flux? And which Flux framework am I going to be using? They're more having the conversation about, okay, let's build out our app, just use state for now, and then see where the problems are, and address it. So I haven't touched much on Redux or MobX in this talk, and I'm not really super going to, because I think they have their special place, and their special place is this. When you have an object, let's say we have person here, and we have age, and we have another attribute here, allowed inside people, it's an array. When you have a state tree like this, and you have an attribute here, age, when age changes and it goes, let's say, over 18, suddenly this person is supposed to go inside this people array. That's where you can use Redux or MobX. When you have these like really complicated object graphs that depend on things changing, when this thing changes, these 5 things must change predictably in tandem. That's where you want MobX and Redux. If you're just doing a simple page where the majority of your state can live in the URL and you've got some very basic state interactions, you're maybe storing some information from an API and rendering it on the page, you don't really need Redux or MobX. You can get by just fine with normal state. And I'm going to show you in a little bit, I'm going to show you some hooks to help you out with that as well. Flux is dead, long-lived context providers, or internal component state. Normalizing your state isn't the same thing as it used to be. Use reducer is not the be-all and end-all. If you can do like 5 or 6 isolated use states instead of one big use reducer, and the ergonomics are the same to you, prefer doing the smaller ones, because reducers break people's heads. They are a whole lot of code for what they give you is predictability and reliability and idempotency, which are incredibly important things in the correct context. If your context is I'm keeping track of items in a list, then maybe just use useState. If your context is, again, I've got a deeply nested object where different attributes rely on the same change, making a change in them, then you can use reducer. Don't forget to use memo and use callback. That's important. For those of you who are unfamiliar with use memo and use callback, they are, let's go to the React site here. Docs. They are on the React site. Use memo. There we go. You can just go read this article, hooks reference, and they will explain to you what they're doing. They can save you countless render cycles. I've worked on apps where we would have over 800 renders for like one prop change, and then we just littered use memo and use callback everywhere, and one prop change would cause like 2 renders now instead of 800, which is nice. And that brings us into the tail end of the talk. Don't overuse context. I am so personally guilty of using context for just about any and everything because I want to be able to jump between components. Context should be your last resort. You should pull out into context as a last resort, not as a first option. Yeah. And that's it. We're going to move into questions. Before we do, okay, thanks, bye. I'm Other Ben. You can email me at this. You can contract me at Vulcan Labs. We're also hiring at Vulcan Labs, so if you want to get a snazzy React job, please email me or contact me on zatech@otherben.
Cool.
Right.
If no one else minds, so like I said earlier, I've kind of used React quite a bit back then when everything was class based and old school, and Redux was still some pipe dream coming down the line. Moved to other things and kind of come back now, like I said earlier. What has been kind of overwhelming was kind of this mix of the old school way and where we are now, and in the future things to come. So, meaning everything was class and everything was set state and kept everything on the page and all that stuff. And then it kind of moved now to use state and hooks. And Redux was also kind of littered in there. So my question kind of is if someone's starting out now, what would be a good like snapshot of today's world to learn, which will give them a good footing into how does the current modern React page look, and page being like a traditional sense, like you say, you hit a page, it calls some data, there's a loading state, it throws it up on the screen, some kind of action. Really big one. Yeah.
Good question. I don't know. I haven't looked at beginner tutorials in a long time, and I usually so there are probably some React hooks examples of to-do lists. So that might be a good place to start. But I know there was, if you follow the JS newsletter, the React Weekly, they have in this week's thing a list of actual production open source React applications. So for example, Sentry is one, and I know their code is quite nice, and Grafana as well. So maybe go open up that
I
React
literally have
newsletter.
it here. Yeah. Examples of
Yeah,
large production grade open source React apps. Nice.
yeah. So go take a look at that.
Okay.
Maybe that answers your question.
Cool.
Can I do a who has been? Sure, I can do a who has been. I am principal engineer for Vulcan Labs. Vulcan Labs is a small consultancy. We do three kinds of work. Either we take over long-standing old projects that are moving slowly. We take over the development, we make it move quick again, and then we keep it with us. Secondly, we help out teams that aren't performing great. We join those teams, boots to the ground, working with them every day, help them improve their technical practices, help them improve their processes, and then eject ourselves when they're performing well again. And we do new product development. You are a startup, you need something built, we build it for you. And then when you have good market traction and some money, we help you build out your own team to finish or maintain your software long term. So a bit about me is a bit about Vulcan Labs because we are so tightly intertwined nowadays. More about me, I like sci-fi, I like chess, I like Darkest Dungeon, and I like music, like television, and that's about it.
Dark's Dungeon is amazing. It really is. I have some questions, if you don't mind, Ben.
I just want to answer Tim. No, I haven't used Recoil yet. I've looked at it. It looks pretty nifty. It looks like the future potentially, but I need to actually use it before I can make that call. Old school React SPA to TypeScript. Just start. When you're converting to TypeScript, just start because you can mix and match JavaScript and TypeScript. So you just kind of put TypeScript in the project, and for everything new, you write TypeScript. For everything old you touch on, you convert to TypeScript step by step. If your code base is 90% any for the first few months, that's absolutely fine. You don't have to be perfect from the get-go. Skulk, you had a question?
Jeez, I have several, but so maybe just to start, like, yeah. So I've also kind of I've actually tried out recoil a bit. I actually had a very good use case for it, but in my experience, it's very use case specific. I don't think it'll necessarily replace anything that we currently have per se. It's essentially it's really helpful if you need to have the same functionality as use context, but you don't know how many contexts you're going to need. So you can essentially think of it as kind of a dynamic array of use contexts that can. So I think the kind of the to-do app version of Recoil, kind of that they use for the demo, is kind of like almost like a something like Photoshop, or where you draw shapes and things.
Yeah, I saw that example.
Because because those things, like, because the state of those things can't be like at such a low level in the app. So like the state of the square can't be in the square component itself. It needs to sit really high up. So obviously that would be a use case for use context. But because you're drawing and you're creating things, like, you're actually dynamically creating these use contexts as you go. So it's really useful for that. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily going to replace anything in the stock standard, like kind of apps that we build nowadays, unless you're building something like that. But so in terms of my questions, geez, I'm so glad, like you said, don't overuse context. I think at some point you said something like Redux is dead, long live context, and I was like, sure, because like I just see context abused and misused so much, like in projects, like to the point where we're essentially just creating like MVCs again, like it's essentially just like an MVC that is built with React, by using use context. Like it kind of goes against the whole principle of like one directional data flow and all of that. But so I think my specific question is regarding Storybook or something similar. Do you kind of use these tools at all?
Yes. So I have built my fair share of design systems in my lifetime. And Storybook is pretty much the best solution there is out there. I find it very slow. It's like frustratingly slow, and I don't know why. I don't understand why. But there is no better alternative to Storybook. What you should check out if you're doing Storybook, if you want to build a Storybook library with TypeScript, there's a package called TSDX, which is basically like Create React App, but for React libraries. So if you want to make reusable components and stuff, you can use TSDX to do that. Nifty tidbit.
Yeah, you have shared that quite a bit with me, but also regarding the speed of Storybook, yeah, I hear you. But apparently, with I think the latest major release, they did a lot of work in terms of speed optimization and so forth. So it might be worth looking like into that. Do you, like, on that topic, do you make any meaningful distinction in terms of like separating like UI concerns from like business logic concerns in the way you kind of structure your code base?
Yeah, so generally business logic goes into service components. And if you have the kind of clean cut separation of, hey, I have a design system, then your business logic generally doesn't conflate itself too much with your UI concerns. Which is why I'm such a big proponent of design systems. It just facilitates that so well. Otherwise, I'm gonna get shot for this, but do stuff until it hurts. So mix your business logic into your UI stuff as much as you want until it starts hitting you, and then you know when to
Mm,
stop,
mm,
and where not to do it. There is
mm,
no one size fits all answer,
mm.
unfortunately.
Yeah. Dan Abramov called it an annoyance-driven development. um, but I think that also um, Michael. I think that also kind of goes to your question about like how do you learn how to build like a React page in 2020, and I think that is something that's inherently difficult about React. Is I think the way that React kind of approaches like like the whole JavaScript framework thing is that it doesn't necessarily give you a framework. It gives you primitives, and you can do with those primitives what you want. You know, like you can like it's not like as opinionated in terms of like, okay, this is how you do routing, this is how you fetch data,
Mm.
this is kind of how you structure things. And I think to like that has been extremely successful. Like I mean, like, you know, like what we're on like React what now, and the API has seen so little changes compared to something like Angular, which is like at this point just a completely different product. So I think by them just kind of like having this super low level focus, it has allowed them to kind of move very rapidly without kind of breaking like these bigger level things that they've kind of built. But with that kind of comes a problem in terms of like, okay, so how do you use these primitives then? And I think that's not, there is no official answer to that. There's probably a lot of very smart people that will kind of fight tooth and nail in terms of, no, you're doing it wrong. No, you're doing it wrong. So yeah, that
So that's
I guess it comes with the territory.
I mean, that's exactly my point. Is that jumping back into Vue, it took me a week to kind of get back up to, because it was very opinionated. The documentation was very like straightforward, and this is how we do things. Jumping back into React, it's like every little tutorial, I'm kind of learning pieces that, you know, I'm picking up pieces that I can use in my context and building up this sort of knowledge base on what is sort of the older way of doing things, what's new, what's on the horizon, and sort of destructuring all these things and building up my own internal library of, okay, in my context, in what I know now, this is how I can build up the page, and this makes sense. Don't do that with state, because that's not how we do it now. You're going to run into pitfalls later on. Or you pick up an article where you can read, okay, this is the pitfalls of doing this thing, or things to think about why you shouldn't be using. And I'll be like, actually, that I am going to run into that little thing. Maybe I should think about changing it. Then you go back and you learn something new and have to reshuffle things. So it's just that I feel like it's a lot of wheel spin that I'm doing to try and build an application for a client and that. So I was just kind of like, I mean, it's quite an interactive medium. So I was just thinking, is there any way that has, you know, I haven't seen yet where, oh, why didn't you check React Weekly? It has a whole page on this is how we do things right now today, the 9th of September, you know. But it isn't like that. I mean, and that is something I'm sort of slowly um you know, getting to grips with, where it is a process and there's so many different ways you can build something. Yeah.
Kiffy asked a really good question that I'm just gonna ignore.
Yeah, he wants to start some trouble now.
I'm not gonna ignore it. Unit testing class components versus unit testing hooks. I think React testing library changes the conversation a bit there. But generally what I found is if your dependency parameters on hooks are good enough, then you kind of know how to trigger the props through the hooks through your props. Class-based components, you obviously can mock and stub out things a lot easier than you can with hooks, but Yeah, you have to do some dirty stuff once you're using hooks and you're testing, because you have to do global mocking and stubbing because you don't have as much inversion of control. And I mean, you could always. So the problem is that there's not enough inversion of control, so you can just go ahead and invert more control from your hooks. But that makes your API a bit more clunky. So it's kind of up to you how far you want to go. But I will admit that testing hooks is a bit harder than testing class components.
What I've had like a lot of success with is um, kind of like if I like but I think this also comes to a conversation about like testing and like how much do you test, and like do you rely more on unit tests or end-to-end testing or so forth. But I think what I've had a lot of success with, like the things in hooks that generally cause me a lot of headache, is more like complex functions and things. So I tend to rather just extract them into helper functions and then specifically just do a functional test on that helper function. But I guess it's also, it depends on like what you're building. If you're building like something for like Absa Bank, then obviously you just want to test everything. You want to like, if a color changes, you want like alarms to go off. But like some other things, like it might be a bad return on investment, like just like going through all that trouble to unit test something where if it breaks, it's like, oh, okay, cool. Like I'll just let the dev know and he'll fix it. So I guess it depends on context, but I think for me a nice middle ground has been to pull out like really problematic things as far as possible into their own separate helper functions that I pull into the hook. But I'm also maybe going to use this to kind of ask another question. So I think something that I've been having a lot of success with, especially with, and I think maybe this riffs a bit on your concept of variant and so forth. And it's interesting, I've kind of arrived at kind of the same approach as well. And I think what I like to do with kind of the variant thing is, because you're essentially passing in strings, like you can actually create an object that maps things to that. So you can say like, you can have like a background color map or whatever, and that's just an object with all the variant like names as keys, and then just like the actual property. So I think it's for me it's kind of also a neat way of kind of organizing all the mutually exclusive ways in which like a component can be like rendered through like a variant. But one thing I've had a lot of success with as well is kind of like, and this is maybe borrowing from like kind of like a finite state machine approach of like as also using something called like phase. So where components have like mutually exclusive phases, and it can only be in one phase at a time. So whether that's like loading or whether that's like, geez, I'm going to have to use a super contrived example now, but awaiting response or whatever, and not treating those as kind of individual variables, like like has a request been sent, has a request come back, has a user started entering information, like is there like two items or is there no items, like rather like trying to treat these as kind of mutually exclusive phases that the component can be in. So I'm interested in hearing like whether kind of you've been able to kind of extend this kind of variant approach of like these mutually exclusive things into other areas where it's kind of made your code more readable and easier to understand.
Probably. I can't give you an immediate answer of exactly where that would have happened, but probably. I use enums all over. That's just my style. I just want to be conscious of time. I have all the time in the world to be here, but if people want to start dropping off, I'm not going to be offended by that.
I think some have already. So too late to be offended now.
Cool.
Are there any more questions?
I think the last one is it possible or wise to be platform agnostic and keeping up to date with each framework? It's wise. Keeping up to date with most of the big frameworks is gonna teach you how to think differently. And if you look at all the other frameworks, hooks kind of shook the world up and everyone went, okay, we need to do something like hooks. But a lot of what's new and nice in React came from Viewland or from Angular land. So having that cross-pollination, if you can, just read their weekly newsletters to keep a pulse of what's going on in the rest of the world. Except if it's Svelte. Svelte can go away. I don't like Svelte.
But I think it's also important to kind of hedge that, like in the concept of that as additional. Like that's not, because I think it's very easy to get from a point of like feeling that I need to keep up with everything and like I just can't cope. There's just too much. So that is, I always see that as kind of extramural like activities. I've had a lot of success with actually playing around with Elm quite a bit, and also seeing like a lot of like how a lot of React principles were influenced by what stuff like Elm initially did. Yeah, no, I definitely concur with that.
Okay, cool. Are we gonna call it then? If there aren't
Come on,
any more
Michael.
questions.
I know there's one more. Cool. Last chance? Nope. So cool, awesome. Thanks a lot, Ben. This was super insightful for myself as well. And thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks to everyone that kind of stuck around till the end. I know like it's getting late now, and now that lockdown isn't as stringent as it used to be, like people have other things to do in the evenings as well. But yeah, so for those that are interested, I'm probably going to upload this video to YouTube. So for those of you that don't know, so like these talks form part of like a bigger thing that Justin and Shaylin and I organize under kind of the banner of Front-End Development South Africa, and neither of them are here. But yeah, so like we have a YouTube channel where we upload these. I'll probably get to actually doing that probably tomorrow. So I will then send a link. Yeah, I see someone said Shaylin was here. Emphasis on the was. I don't know where he went. So yeah, but I'll like for those of you that are on ZA Tech, I'll probably share the video in the Front-End Development channel. Otherwise, I'll probably share it on the meetup event itself. Yeah, so with that, I don't know, Ben, if you maybe have any last words, any kind of anything you want to plug?
Yeah, we're hiring is the first thing. So contact me on zatech at otherben or benyanaka@gmail.com. And you can contract me as well. Just contact me on the same channels.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully, I'll see all of you again soon. Take care.